Hello, thank you for joining me. I'd like to talk about the trends of migration and urbanization in China today in this short video. I wanted to start with this picture of the city of Shenzhen. You can see one picture is from 1979, the beginning of the reform era, and then the other is from 2016. And what you can see in these two pictures, I hope, is just how quickly the cities are developing in China. That we have a very short time period here, but the cities are growing really, really large. Some of the cities in China today are among the largest in the world, with populations of upwards of 24 million. So these are really, really large cities, but as you can see from this picture of Shenzhen in 1979, China started out as a very rural country. And in fact, I think a lot of us still think of China mostly as a rural country. And increasingly what we're seeing is China's now becoming an urban country. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about these trends and what's driving these trends and whether this is problematic. First of all, the chart that I have on the slide right now, you can see the change in the urbanization rate over time. And what I wanted to point out is how much this has accelerated. So again, if you start looking at the beginning of the reform era between right around 1979, 1980, you can see the fast pace of reform or of urbanization that's been occurring. And if you look at where we are right now, you can see that China is roughly at a slightly more than midway point. So it's just a little bit over 50% urbanized. It's probably about 55% right now, maybe close to 60. And so what you can see is that prior to this time period, China was a majority rural country. So it was probably about 2/3 rural. Only 1/3 of its population lived in the cities. And now we see that that's changed. And so we have between 55 and 60% of the population living in cities in China today. But this is actually set to change even more quickly, where we expect that within the next 15 to 17 years, we're actually going to see that the majority of China's population, about 2/3 of its population, live in cities. So this will change China in a fairly quick time period, in about 2 decades, from a majority rural country to a majority urban country. And this sort of huge shift in a very short period of time of a lot of people creates some advantages, but it also creates some problems. So one of these problems is that urbanization in China, it is happening in a specific context. And so I want to very quickly describe this context, although it's complicated, right? Just like everything about China. So urbanization in China, the way that it happens, it isn't strictly a family's decision about where to move. In fact, these decisions are controlled by what we call the hukou system. Hukou, you can see, are just 2 characters out of this longer name, which means household registration system. This system was designed under Mao Zedong, and it was basically designed to keep families, so wherever a family was born is where they would remain. So if you happen to be born in a city, you then had an urban household registration and you remained in that city. If you were born in a rural area and you didn't have access to this urban household registration, you couldn't then move and live in the city. And so basically, this system was designed to control the pace of urbanization. So instead of families deciding when and where they wanted to move, you had to apply to change your household registration. This is a really difficult thing to do. So most families, if they move, they can't change their site of household registration. So what does this mean? Well, practically what this means is that because all of the social services that a citizen would receive are delivered at the local level, if you aren't registered to live in a certain area, you don't have access to those services. So if you move from the countryside into a city, you can do that, right? So that it's not illegal to move into the city, but it sort of puts you in a legal gray zone of you can live wherever you want, but you're not entitled to receive services in that area. So what this means then is that most Chinese citizens have access to relatively inexpensive subsidized health care. They also have access to a whole suite of sort of social insurance schemes, right? Like pensions, unemployment insurance, low income insurance. All of these things are delivered to you when you're living in the area in which your family is registered. So if you move to a city like Shenzhen, and this isn't where you're registered, you have to pay for all of these things out of pocket. So your children's education, instead of it being free, you have to pay for it. If you get sick and need to go to the hospital, instead of that being mostly covered, instead you would have to pay out of pocket. So you can see that what this does is it basically takes anyone who moves into a city and isn't registered to live there and puts them in a second-class citizen status, where they're going to have to pay more out of their disposable income to have access to the same services that their urban counterparts have. So what does this system mean? Well, what it means is that people are still moving, right? So it's not that this system has stopped people from moving. They're still moving at really, really large numbers. We tend to call these people the floating population, and we call them that because they're not officially registered to live in the area in which they're living. So they're sort of floating, right? And if you look at the numbers of people who belong to this group that we call the floating population, you can see it's a really large population. So it's right around 240 million. And these are estimates, these aren't exact numbers. So you'll see that the estimates range anywhere from 200 million up to 300 million. So this is a really large population, right? So it's equivalent to the population of the entire United States is basically in this category of a floating population, meaning that they're living in an urban area, even though they're registered to live in a rural area. And this means, again, that of course they can live in this area, but it means that they don't have access to any social services. So when we think about who these people are, I'd like to talk a little bit more about who makes up this category. Basically, what we're seeing is that this is a working age population. So you can see that about 80% of the floating population is in this category of, age 15 to 35, this sort of normal working age population. And you can see in this chart that they're even older migrants. So this is the 50 years older or above. So that we still have a sizable group here. These are people who were basically the first wave of migrants. So these are the people who, in that time period in Shenzhen that we looked at the picture from, 1979 into the 80s, when we saw the first wave of people from the countryside moving into the cities to work in the factories. A lot of those people have, instead of returning to where they were born, remained living in the cities. And so even though we see that a lot of these economic migrants are floating to different cities looking for jobs, they earn their money, and then they move back to where they were born, a lot of these migrants actually stay in these cities and raise their families there. So we have more than one generation of floating population. Another change that we see is that, so I talked about how there are multiple waves, right? So the wave that we saw in the 80s and the 90s, this was sort of the first wave of rural migrants who were moving to the cities, mostly along the coast, in order to work in the factories. So this type of migration was long distance migration. These were people from the interior of the country moving to the coastal provinces where most of the factories were, so places like Shenzhen. So this was the first wave of migration, but then in the 2000s, we've continued to see people migrate, but that migration pattern looks a little bit different. Instead, what we tend to see is that people are moving from the countryside around a city into that city. So rather than a migrant moving from Sichuan province in the middle of the country to Shenzhen on the coast to work in a factory, instead we see that people inside of Sichuan province are moving to the cities inside of that province. So instead of seeing people move from rural provinces to more urban provinces, instead we're seeing that the provinces themselves have rural and urban divisions. And so most of the migrants who live in the urban areas are in fact from that province, just a more rural part of it. So we tend to instead see, instead of this long distance migration, we tend to see more short distance migration. And in the China Labor Bulletin chart that I've supplied, you can see this trend represented with the blue bar and the red bar. So people still are moving long distances to find jobs, but increasingly they're going to work at the closest city. So the other profile that I wanted to talk about these migrants that's changing, so it's still a working age population, that's remained constant, but we see that these migrants are more short distance migrants than they are long distance migrants, and also the types of jobs that they're doing is changing. So that first wave of migration that we saw in the 80s and early 90s, where people were going to work mostly factory jobs and some construction in these new large cities, this has changed. So we see that a lot of migrants are now doing other sorts of jobs. So if you look at the chart, the pie chart that I've supplied, you can see that there's hotel and catering services, transport and logistics, sales, construction, manufacturing. That increasingly we see that instead of the migrants simply working in manufacturing or construction, that there are other types of jobs. And some of these, instead of just being blue collar jobs, are also white collar jobs. So migration itself is changing in what people are doing. You can also see that there's a large disparity in salaries as far as what types of jobs migrants are taking. The one thing that I want to point out that's remained constant and I want to talk about next is this idea of social insurance coverage. So remember that the household registration system, it doesn't say that you can't move from the countryside and live in the city, but what it says is that all of your social services will only be supplied in the place in which you were born. So if you move to the city, you have to pay for all of these services out of pocket. And so if you look at the charts, these are ranging from 2008 to 2013. What you can see is that although there are some services that are increasingly being available for rural migrant workers, most of the time these services aren't being delivered. So for example, if you look at unemployment insurance, maternity insurance, things like pensions, you can see that these are supplied at very, very low levels. So even the category that has the highest coverage, which is the work-related injury insurance, you can see that that is available basically for about 28% of workers, and that's the one with the most coverage. So all of these other types of social insurance that urban residents have access to, you can see that rural migrant workers don't have access to these, which means that regardless of what their salary is, and their salaries have been increasing, but regardless of these increases in their salary, it creates this category of citizen, which is basically a second-class citizen. So even if they have the same job as somebody who lives in the city, they won't be as advantaged because they'll have to use more of their salary to pay for things like health care. If they lose their job, they don't have any insurance, or to put their kids through school, these sorts of expenses. This slide, I just wanted to quickly summarize what we've already discussed, but basically what you can see is that migration is changing in China, so the type of people who are migrants, what they're doing, all of these things are changing, but what has remained constant is the fact that a large number of people are moving from the countryside into the cities, and the other thing that's remained constant is the hukou, or household registration system, and how this creates a disadvantage for these rural migrants. So The reason that we see that the hukou system hasn't been reformed up to this point is that basically there were a lot of advantages to this type of migration. So even though these people were moving into the cities in really, really large numbers, the local city government didn't have to supply any more services. So they had more residents who were working and paying taxes, but they didn't have to supply any sort of services. We also saw that in the rural areas, which were really difficult to develop. So a lot of these areas are really mountainous. It's hard to extend electricity, it's hard to extend phone lines or transportation networks. That in these areas, we saw that there was a certain amount of development without the government having to invest. And this was because of remittances. So for the migrants, when they moved to a place like Shenzhen and they worked in their factory job, they would send the bulk of their savings home to their families. So their families then were able to invest in farm equipment or nicer houses or sending siblings to school. And so we saw a lot more development of rural areas without the government needing to invest. And we also saw that the idea that these people were in the urban areas temporarily was sort of like a safety net. So, for example, if you think about the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, even though you saw that a lot of factories closed in China because consumers in the US and in Europe were no longer buying as many products, those workers had the safety net of returning to the land. And so the bulk of those workers who were unemployed returned home to the farms, they worked with their families, and they weren't starving. The government didn't need to supply any sort of social insurance for them, like unemployment insurance or low income insurance. And so basically what you see is that this system of the household registration, or the hukou, has a lot of advantages for the government. However, I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that the problems of this household registration system, or having a floating population, greatly outweigh the advantages. And this is for a lot of reasons, and I'll go ahead and put all of these reasons up on the slide to talk about. But basically, what you have to remember is that when people move from the countryside into the cities, even though it's not illegal for them to be there, they're not a registered resident of the city. So this means that they don't have access to social services in the city, including law enforcement. So if they're working, let's say, for an employer who is exploiting them, let's say that they're not being paid what they were promised to be paid, or they're being paid late. So whenever they're supposed to be paid, their employer isn't paying them. So these sorts of situations happen all of the time. But if you're employing economic migrants, they're not likely to go to the police and complain about this, simply because the police will say, you're not a registered resident, therefore we can't help you, and they actually might get deported. So oftentimes the police do these roundups where they say that, if you're not registered to live in the city, that they're going to put you on trains and send you back to your home province. And so it's really dangerous for economic migrants to go to the police. So what this tends to do then is create the chance for exploitation. So we see that that's a problem. We also see that there's the problem of what I've been calling the creation of a second-class citizen. So because these rural migrants are living in urban areas, but they have to use most of their disposable income for social services, it means that they tend not to provide these services. So their children, for example, don't get a lot of preventative medical care. When they do go to school, their school is more expensive but of lower quality. So the education standards for the children of economic migrants is much lower than those of urban residents. And so it's effectively creating a system of first-class citizens who are urban residents, and they have monetary advantages, but they also have the provision of good healthcare, good education. And then you have these second-class citizens, the floating population, these rural migrants who are living in urban areas, but they don't have access to the same services. Their children are less healthy, less educated. So this is a problem. Another problem is the hollowing out of the rural areas. So this is sometimes called the left behind children, if you've heard of this problem. But what we tend to see is that because these migrants are a working age population, they tend to move to these cities, they start working their jobs, and when they decide to start their family, because they don't have access to a support network, so because their families aren't there to provide childcare, they tend to send their children home to live with their parents. So what you tend to see is that in urban areas, there's a working age population, and in rural areas, that working age population is hollowed out so that you tend to see only the very young and the very old. And this is creating a lot of problems, a lot of social changes. So you see a whole generation that are being raised by their grandparents who aren't paying a lot of attention to them, especially their education. But you also tend to see this sense of hopelessness. So for the children who are left in the rural areas, they have this sense that everything's happening in the urban areas, and that if you live in the rural areas, you're at a disadvantage, you won't have a good job, and your future is fairly bleak. So there have been a number of suicide pacts that the left behind children have participated in, and this has really captured a lot of media attention in China and the government trying to respond to the left behind children. But again, unless you change the household registration system, these families aren't able to bring their children with them. So all of these problems then that we see with this type of urbanization, so urbanization under this household registration system, none of these problems can be addressed until the household registration system is reformed. And so I wanted to show you an example of this. I've talked a lot about these macro trends, about what's happening across all of China. And I wanted to use this case study of the city of Chongqing, which used to be part of Sichuan province, which is in the middle of the country. It's grown so large, though, that it's become its own city province, a status sort of like that of Beijing. And so I wanted to show you this short clip so that you could see what's happening with Chongqing and this influx of really, really rapid migration.
As dawn breaks, this port city fills with bang-bang men and other migrant workers. Chongqing is witnessing one of the great movements of humanity. Every year, 500,000 people move off the land and into the skyscrapers. And as they move in, the city has to spread out. From horizontal green fields to vertical grey tower blocks, this is where the country meets the city, and it's clear which is winning. By 2020, the urban population is forecast to double from 10 to 20 million. Every day, builders complete 70,000 square metres of floor space. They're working on 8 new bridges, 8 new motorways, and 8 new rail links. The builders are all migrants. Chen Li came here when he was 16. In the 9 years since, he reckons he has built 60 or 70 tower blocks.
The buildings are getting better and taller.
The biggest is still to come. The city has plans for a 98-story tower, which will be one of the tallest in the world. The change has turned Li Zheguan's life sideways. This former farmer now spends half his day dangling over the sides of skyscrapers, suspended by a single clip. It's dangerous, but he feels his job is more secure because he can see the number of new windows to clean increasing before his eyes.
I'm seeing a very big change in the city. From up here, you can notice the difference in the space of a week.
And so what we see then in Chongqing with this really rapid urbanization rate, one of the fastest in the country, is that increasingly you have this creation of what we've talked about of sort of first-class urban residents, and then these rural migrants into the city who live really difficult lives. They work long hours, they don't have access to social insurance, and even if they have equivalent jobs, they're going to be poorer than their urban counterparts because they have to pay for social services out of their disposable income. And so in Chongqing, they're running a pilot study where they're trying to think about how could you change the household registration system. So one problem is that, or I shouldn't say that this is a problem because we don't know if it's a problem, but what the government is afraid of is that if you simply drop the household registration system, and you say that people can move wherever they'd like to move, live wherever they'd like to live, is that people would flood into these cities and the cities wouldn't be able to provide services. So, garbage pickup, housing, all of these sorts of things, that the cities would basically be overwhelmed. So what the government would like to do is they would like to increase the urbanization rate at a slower pace so that cities could respond by building more housing, having more schools, more hospitals. And so what Chongqing is doing is they've set this rate that over the next decade that they'd like to reach a 75% urbanization rate, which would effectively create one of the largest cities in the world. So the population then would be close to 30 million people, which is a really large city. So the way that the pilot study is working is that they basically have said to any of the rural migrants currently living in the city that if you live in the city of Chongqing, you can apply for your urban hukou or your urban household registration. And so you would be able to change your status from being a rural migrant, sort of that gray category that we talked about, not exactly illegal, but not having access to social services, instead to having fully registered legal status and being able to receive these services. The problem is, because this sounds like a really great pilot study, but the problem that they've seen is that there were a certain number of people living in Chongqing who said, absolutely, I'm willing to give up my land and accept this urban status. But for a lot of the rural migrants, they weren't willing to give up their claim to their land in the countryside. So this is a really difficult situation because for people who are living in the city, once you have an urban residency, you aren't allowed to own land in the countryside. So this household registration system actually works in really complicated ways. It keeps city people in the city and it keeps people in the countryside in the countryside. So it's difficult to move back and forth. So for somebody who is a worker in Chongqing but thinks that they would eventually like to return and be a farmer or live on their family farm, if they give up the land now, they won't be able to purchase land in the future. So this is a decision where they have to decide right now whether they want to be an urban resident forever or a rural resident forever. And you can imagine that this is a really difficult decision, a really complicated decision. And so what we've seen is that a certain number of people have refused to participate and they continue to work in the city but still are registered as rural residents. So what we've learned from this pilot study is that it's really difficult to reform the household registration system without first, or at least at the same time, reforming the way that land is owned and controlled in China. So we see that there are also a number of pilot studies taking place in China that are trying to also address this issue of land reform. So this is a really complicated problem. We also see that I talked about urbanization as almost this linear process, right, where all rural residents want to live in the cities. But we do see that there are also a number of people who either want to remain in the countryside or are actually urban residents who've decided that they want to live in the country and that they no longer want an urban lifestyle. So you can see the video that is linked here called Down to the Countryside. And this is a very short video, about 10 minutes, that profiles this Bishan project. So Bishan is a city in Anhui province. It's this rural village that you can see pictured here. And you see that there are a group of artists led by Ning, who is pictured here, who decided that they were going to move back to the countryside. They were going to create a rural cooperative where all of the rural residents work together to develop the village. And it's a very different idea of development. So rather than development being that everybody from the countryside move into the city, instead the idea is, well, maybe we could develop the countryside for a sustainable lifestyle that would actually be really attractive to people. And so some of the projects then that you see in Bishan are that they hold these film and photography they hold different like exhibitions, but they also have this really big concert that they do in the summer. Some of their other projects are that they run these, I'm not sure exactly how to describe them, sort of like training workshops for how to be a farmer. That might sound a little bit strange, but it's basically the idea that there are traditional handicrafts as well as farming techniques that aren't being passed on to a new generation and are basically being forgotten. And so they'll run these training workshops where people from the city come and they learn how to do organic farming. Or in this particular city in Bishan, they have a tradition of woodworking. And so this is another skill that they teach. They also have used the internet to create, to use sort of an eBay site. In China, this is called Taobao, to create a site where they sell organic vegetables to nearby cities. So these are all sorts of projects that they've done in this village with the idea that you can develop the villages and have a good lifestyle without everybody having to move to the countryside. So this is really fascinating experiment, and I visited Bishan, and it's a really fascinating way to think about different types of development, that development doesn't have to just look like something that you see in the cities. So to wrap up, what I hope that you learned from this short video is what migration looks like in China, what urbanization looks like, so what the trends are, the fast pace of this, but also the way that it's structured through politics. So how the household registration system and the way that land is owned in China has basically created this division between urban residents who have more advantages, who have better health and education outcomes, and rural residents who are basically second-class citizens. And even when they move into cities, that second-class citizen status remains because of the household registration system. And so one thing to think about is that if there's such a disadvantage to moving to the cities, why do we see that there is such a large floating population? So what's available in the urban areas versus rural areas? What does life look like for an urban family and a rural family? So this would be a great activity to do with students, where you could have them investigate what a day in the life of your average urban resident or rural resident looks like. So for children the same age as your students, what is life like in Shenzhen versus rural Sichuan? And so why would people then make the decision to move? And then another question, which is a larger question, are these differences, is the creation of first-class citizens and second-class citizens, is this going to create social conflict in the future? So is it sustainable to basically have two different types of citizens based on where you're born? And then a third question that might be interesting to explore is trying to understand more of how the household registration system interacts with the land ownership system to create a situation where even if rural residents are offered the option of urban registration, that they might turn it down in order to hold on to their rural land. So this is looking at the ways that any sort of policy change is much more complicated. So it's not simply changing one policy, but it's changing that policy plus the other policies that are interlinked. So in this case, we're talking about household registration and we're talking about land ownership. So I hope that this lecture has been helpful in understanding the trends of migration and urbanization in China, as well as the problems, and hopefully some idea about possible solutions moving forward as a way to change the household registration system. Thank you.